Thank you. Thank you, Yaron. Can everybody hear me? All right. As you know, the title for tonight's talk is Global Capitalism, the Solution to World Oppression and Poverty. A proper understanding of global capitalism is sorely lacking today because, more fundamentally, an understanding is lacking of capitalism in general, of its nature, its history, and its benefits. This talk seeks to accomplish two tasks. One, to show the enormous universal benefits of global capitalism, and two, to explain that and how these benefits flow directly and necessarily from capitalism's basic nature. It is possible to start with an example. During World War II, Hong Kong's economy was badly damaged by Japanese occupation. And making matters worse, several years later, a flood of refugees arrived fleeing the communist conquest of China. In the mid-1950s, many of the penniless Chinese who had fled the mainland subsisted in temporary quarters, in one-room cells in a multi-story building that was open in front, one family, one room. Like many third-world countries, Hong Kong was desperately poor. In 1960, for example, its average per capita income was approximately only 25% of that in Great Britain, its mother country. But in the 40 years since, its economic progress has been one of the great success stories in the history of mankind. It developed productive industries in textiles, electronics, plastics, watches, and clocks. It became one of the leading financial centers of East Asia. By 1996, its per capita income was 137% of that of its former mother country, Great Britain. Average individual wealth in Hong Kong by the late 1990s was greater than in Germany or even than Japan. Prior to the Asian crisis of the late 90s, its per capita wealth was creeping up on that in America, the world's most affluent nation. In fact, the most affluent nation in the history of the world. Today, per capita income in Hong Kong is in the mid-$20,000 range, making it one of the most prosperous places on earth, ever. In a mere 4 decades, at a breakneck pace, Britain's island colony rose. What factor or factors made possible such extraordinary economic progress? Perhaps it should first be noted those factors that were not responsible. Hong Kong, for example, has virtually none of the factors that modern intellectuals view as a source of wealth. The island has no natural resources. It has no oil, no coal, no iron ore, no timber, no fertile agricultural lands. The former Soviet Union, for example, had vastly more such resources, as do many African countries, yet they were and are poor, even destitute, while Hong Kong is wealthy. Further, Hong Kong has an extraordinarily high population density, which is a factor that modern thinkers often consider a cause of poverty. The Sham Sui Po district of Kowloon, for example, has a population density of greater than 425,000 people per square mile, which makes it 18 times as crowded as New York City. And when I'm on the subway in New York, I always think of that, too. Hong Kong per square mile has 14 times as many people as Japan, 20 times as many as India, and 185 times as many as America. While Hong Kong has, as do many places, a great harbor, its greatest natural resource is one that it shares with every country on earth: the intelligence of its inhabitants. What enables Hong Kong to employ that intelligence to create wealth more effectively than other places is a factor that is not natural but man-made: political economic freedom. In Hong Kong, an individual needed no bureaucratic permission to initiate his own business. He could simply start it up and apply later for a permit. The city became an entrepreneurial hotbed. Imagine the horror of the anti-capitalist, socialist mentalities if it was said to them, what if there were a country in which the government essentially stays out of the economy, one with no tariffs or other legal restrictions on international free trade, with no regulatory agencies, no minimum wage laws, no price or wage controls? Imagine it was said to the welfare statist that the government limits neither investment going in nor profit going out. There's no capital gains tax, no interest tax, no sales tax, and a pittance in corporate bailouts for companies that fail to compete on a free market. This imaginary country has a 15% flat tax, enabling its citizens to retain the overwhelming preponderance of their earnings. Further, It extends no unemployment benefits, enacts no labor legislation, and provides no Social Security, no national health insurance, and scarcely any welfare. The welfare statist would recoil in horror from such a proposal. He would drown his interlocutor with dire warnings regarding the misery of the numberless poor and exploited who would be the inevitable victim of such a heartless, callous system. But in fact, that country exists. It is real. It is Hong Kong, one of the wealthiest places of history. To answer the question succinctly, capitalism is responsible for Hong Kong's wealth. But what is capitalism? What is its nature and its defining essence? The freedom to open your own business and to trade unrestrictedly across national boundaries, as in Hong Kong, is a derivative issue. It is one consistent application of capitalism's fundamental nature: respect for the rights and the freedom of the individual. The essence of the capitalist system is limited government which protects the rights of individuals to live by their own judgment in all areas of life, including both personal morality and economics. Such a system guarantees individuals freedom of speech, of religion, and of intellectual expression. Human beings are free to earn and to own property, their own farms, their own land, their own homes. They are free to start their own businesses and to retain the profits that they earn. Capitalism provides a rule of law that protects private property, safeguards investments, and enforces contractual agreements. The overarching principle is that capitalism is the system of individual rights that cannot be stressed too much, given the prevailing misconceptions on capitalism. So again, I want to stress that the overarching principle is that capitalism is the system of individual rights. Capitalism's history has been so largely ignored, or worse, distorted by Marxist professors and journalists, that it is important to identify some of its most important points. For example, Great Britain during the late 18th and 19th centuries was the first European nation to gradually throw off the oppression of feudalism and of the ancien regime and begin to institute a system of individual rights. Also during this period, Britain's North American colonies fomented a historic revolution that established the freest country of history. In the 19th century, the ideals of individualism, limited government, and capitalism gradually spread to most of the nations of Western Europe, leading there to the overthrow of the ancien regime. For the next 100 years, freedom and capitalism existed exclusively in Western Europe and North America. What were the results of such freedom in the Western world? One economist, Angus Madison, estimates that in Europe in 1700, per capita income was roughly $265, which means that most European nations were akin to Africa today, Africa being, of course, the world's most poorest region, desperately poor, famine-ridden countries. In my own mind, I think of Europe prior to the capitalist revolution of the late 18th century. I think of it as Third World Europe. And in fact, Third World Europe was even poorer than Africa is today, because in Africa today you at least have some degree of automobiles and airplanes and modern medicine and electricity and computers, etc., mostly because of the diffusion of American technology. None of those things existed in Third World Europe in the 18th century, for the obvious reason that none of those things had been invented yet. So I think it's important to realize that Europe, including Britain, just 250 years ago, was poorer than the poorest places on earth today. And the question then becomes, how did they rise? How did the West rise out of such abysmal poverty into the affluence that it currently enjoys? Britain's technological and industrial revolutions in the late 18th and 19th centuries brought enormous progress. For the first time in centuries, the minds of common men, or so-called commoners, distinct from the aristocrats, the minds of common men were freed from bondage to the feudal aristocracy and to the established religion, free to ask and answer scientific questions, to apply newly discovered principles to practical concerns, to invent technologies, to industrialize, and to manufacture vastly increased supplies of consumer goods. James Watt, as one outstanding example, perfected the steam engine.